consortium of different types of topics that we wanted to bring. That some of them did fall in some of the other categories that we didn't have room, but we wanted to make sure that we could cover them. So I'm going to turn this program, this session, over to Ellen Eveland with MSE Group, and let Ellen take the reins and run for this final program, final session. So Ellen, it is all yours. Thank you.
Yes. Good afternoon. I'm grateful, and I'm sure the panelists are grateful for you long haulers who've decided to stick it out on this late Friday afternoon. As Jean said, I'm Ellen Eveland. I work with MSE Group, a Montrose company. The majority of my career has been with doing work for the Department of Defense. So I'm a associate and a federal program manager at MSE. I've been in the business for about 26 years. That doesn't give me the street cred to be in Paul's old guy network. But within my network at the DoD, PFAS has been a buzzword probably for at least a decade. Started off with just doing 5-year reviews and going to all those fire training areas and starting to look at those things. So, and as you all probably know, the 2021 NDAA just authorized $1.4 billion to be spent dealing with PFAS at just DoD facilities. So from everything we've been listening to over the last couple of days, that's just really the tip of the iceberg of what it's going to cost all of us really to clean up the country and the world, honestly. So I'd like to start off by introducing Dr. John Malanchuk. He's going to be talking about funding for PFAS remediation using historical insurance.
Thank you. So I'm going to depend on you to keep me on time. So that's your job. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I mean, this is sort of a one-off from all the technical work that you've been hearing about, but it is a very practical thing because you can use it to fund a lot of the projects that you'd like to be able or are being forced to do. So with that, let me start. And I will try to stick to the script. If I don't, I'll spend a half an hour on each slide, and nobody wants that. So let me just go through the preliminaries I backed into a car the other day in a parking lot, and the first thing the person did that got out of the car would say, I need to have your insurance information. Well, that's exactly right. It's the first thing you think about. But if you have a leaky landfill and you're in a city or a town or someplace and you're having to spend money on it, insurance may not spring to mind. It's no pun intended. And it should, because there's a possibility there that you may be able to bring to bear long, you think, expired insurance policies to help you recover some cash to pay for remediation that you'll be doing in the future. And I'll try to explain. I know that sounds silly, and that's what this talk is about. I'll try to explain how that works. So this is not about pollution coverage. This is no special insurance policy. This is garden variety general liability insurance. You would have it as a part of your homeowner's policy. If you were a city or a town or a company, if you fell on the sidewalk, or if a person fell on the sidewalk and broke their leg, you might tender a claim to the city to reimburse you for the pothole that you stepped into or something like that. That's the same insurance policy that I'm talking about. General liability. A general liability insurance policy covers everything that is not excluded. You know how you see policies today, they exclude mold, they exclude the stereo system in your car, they exclude this or that, but that's what general liability does. It covers everything unless it's excluded. So PFAS is included just by the way the policy was written. So this is a deteriorating asset. We're always, depending on the state that you're in, you're looking at insurance policies that were purchased before 1985. So that's old. They're getting older every year. They don't get any easier to find next year. You don't want to save them for a rainy day. You should use them while you still have the opportunity to do so. So if you can find those policies, or we can find those policies, you can monetize the insurance policies by matching the terms and conditions of the insurance up to I should switch slides. You can match these up to the liabilities and then cash them in without litigation. You don't need to litigate these kinds of cases anymore. In the beginning, back in the, let's say the late 70s, early 80s, when people started doing these things, they were litigated. All the words in the insurance policies were litigated. But if they've been litigated 500 times, you don't really need to litigate them anymore. Everybody knows what accidental release means, or that sort of thing. It's easy. So no point to have litigation over these things. They also have a clause in them that will pay for defense. So if you are a company or a town, a municipality, and you're hiring lawyers to argue with regulators to try to minimize your pain, there's a defense clause in your general liability policies that will pay for those legal costs. So it's good for that. Plus, it's good for past and future remediation costs. So we've heard for the past couple of days, there are lots of PFAS issues in cities, counties, airports, fire training centers, and so on. They're common now. They're everywhere. Some states are a lot more vigorous, shall I say, in pursuing these than others. And of course, that's where we're mostly doing work now. You may have also acquired property over time. You may have, again, if you're a public entity, you may have taken things over for a lack of payment of taxes or those kinds of things. There's ways that you can preserve the insurance rights of the entity that you're taking over so that you can use those insurance policies to pay for your remediation. So we're looking at working with policies that do not have any pollution exclusions in them. If you buy general liability policy today, it will definitely exclude pollution. So, just a word about pollution coverage. If you buy a pollution policy, chances are that pollution policy will cover you for any sort of environmental events that take place going forward, but it's not going to cover you for the sins of the past. In other words, if your house caught on fire, you can't call up the insurance company and buy a policy. It's a little late. The same thing with pollution coverage. It's not going to cover you for the past sins. Okay. So can you go ahead and use these old policies and cash them in for future remediation? The answer is yes. It's still possible to make a claim, and you can recover money that you've spent previously as well as the future remediation costs. So these policies are 40 or 50 years old, but they were written on a different basis. They were an occurrence policy. Today, you mostly have policies that are called claims made. You have to make the claim during the policy period. Before, the occurrence, the accident, the spill had to take place during the policy period. So that means when people discovered that you could breathe an asbestos fiber and 30 years later get cancer, then things started to happen with changing the language in insurance policies. So EPA started in 1970. Asbestos was going strong back then. Those kinds of things, the insurance company said, oh boy, we better start to change the language in the insurance policies. But before that, no exclusions. They were occurrence-based policies. So if you had a leaky tank or a leaky landfill, or you were putting PFAS in the ground, then it's covered. It'll be covered because now the regulations have changed. You're being forced to remediate something today. You can go back to that old occurrence-based policy. Well, the devil is always in the details. So you have to be able to find the insurance. The site facts have to sort of add up. It has to work. This doesn't work in every single case. In fact, it probably doesn't work more often than it does work. So that's one of the issues here, because if you're saying to yourself, this is too good to be true, it can't be possible. Well, what happens is it doesn't work in every single instance. So, but if you're one of those cases where it does work, it's a beautiful thing, and you can recover a lot of money that you didn't know existed. It's like going in your attic and finding a Van Gogh or something. Okay, let's move on. So people worry about, okay, if I make a claim, aren't my premiums going to go up, or isn't my carrier going to drop me, and those kinds of things. Without getting into all those details, if that were true, nobody would do it. And so there's answers to all these questions. I'd be happy to talk to you about it offline, but these are policies which you should cash in while you still have the opportunity to do so. I'm not telling you have to do it by next week, but you know, there's consolidation going on in lots of industries, and the insurance industry is no different. So there are insolvencies in almost every case that we see where you can't recover from the company anymore. What I'm trying to say is you need to get your place at the trough sometime soon, or there won't be anything left to eat. I already said there's no need to litigate these cases anymore. I'm trying. I just can't get it to go. There we go. I want this to sound easy, so you'll think about doing it. At the same time, it's not for everybody. You have to be aware that there are pitfalls in this. And sometimes we see people, they say, wow, that sounds good. That's a lucrative business, and I'm going to go do that. Well, the fact is that over a period of a few decades, we've built up relationships with insurance companies. We know how they think. More importantly, we know how they value the claim. If you go to them with a claim for X amount of money, they're going to value your claim according to the way they think. But having done this for so long, we know what their hot buttons are, and we have a model that we use to value a claim, but we just set up our model to run with their sort of initial conditions, or whatever you want to call it. And we can come very close to where they're going to be in the ballpark. So the simple answer here is that if you get greedy about how much money you want from your old insurance, then the insurance company will say, gee, it's easier to litigate with them than it is to settle, and then it'll go to litigation, and that's not what anybody wants, because that changes the dynamics of everything. So there's pitfalls. And what we do is we use our relationships. We know the likely outcomes. If something has been litigated 10 times and it's in your favor 7 times and it's against you 3 times, then we'll say, okay, well, we'll give you a 30% discount off the price of the claim for that particular issue, that sort of thing. It's all handled as a business transaction. Okay, so all we're talking about here is, once again, balancing the assets against the liabilities, cash out the deteriorating assets. When you get a check from the insurance company, it doesn't have any strings attached. If you want to give yourself a raise, buy a new computer, save it to pay for remediation in the future, that's all up to you. You can just drop it to the bottom line, and a lot of companies have done that. And then they have the money, they work with that money, and then they deal with the regulator as a separate entity, and they manage the remediation process there using the money that they now have in the kitty. So it's a good thing. And lots, we've done tons of work in Florida. I don't know why exactly, but we've done a lot of work in Florida and had lots of success here. I said to somebody over lunch or just before lunch, I think there's 63 manufactured gas plants in Florida, and I believe I've worked on 60 of them, and I've worked on some of them, the same plant, 2 or 3 times for different utilities. So you may not have heard of this before, but it's fairly common. Okay. Why does this work? Help. Okay. Why does the insurance company even answer the phone when you call and say you want to submit a claim? So first of all, it's confidential. We can do it under attorney-client privilege. Sunshine laws and things like that get in the way. You may not be able to keep it confidential, but we can if you want to. You purchased insurance and paid your premiums. You're entitled to reimbursement according to the terms and conditions of those insurance policies. The insurance companies wrote the insurance. So there you go. Insurance companies have reserves set aside for their liabilities. So your liabilities are part of their liabilities. So they have reserves set aside. And oh yeah, don't forget, insurance companies buy insurance. So if they do a deal with you, they release the reserves, they make a claim against their reinsurer, and that's why the process goes on, because it's not such a bad deal for them. They get these liabilities off their books. If you go to them and they say, what do you want? And we say, we want to talk about PFAS. And they say, well, you know, there's no regulations, blah, blah, blah. We say, well, we're giving you a fire sale today because it's not, do you think it's going to get cheaper in the future or more expensive? So on and so forth. And it's in their best interest to settle in the midst of some uncertainty. All right, so the idea is you get to a point in the process where it's a win-win situation for both sides. It's a good thing. If you don't find that point, then it'll go to litigation. Are there any downsides? Not really. If you need the insurance for something else, let's say you wanted to settle out your environmental claims and you had a boatload of asbestos claims someplace else, you wouldn't want to give up that insurance because you might need it. So you have to make special conditions. You carve out the asbestos coverage or something like that. So otherwise, there's really no downside to doing this. It's in your best interest to do this. You don't trigger any new reporting requirements. We're not using any new data. The entire process, as I said, can be done under privilege. We don't think that it may be your data and your insurance, but we don't think you're the expert in understanding that. So we think that you need to point us in the right direction if you're the client, but otherwise your time investment is minimal because we want to look through your records and do the case. And we almost always hire a technical consultant to work with us to put together the technical documents that get submitted to the insurance company. And that's it. I'm done. And I think I'm on time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Malanchuk. I'm glad to see some additional faces. Maybe for next year's forum, we should recommend to Gene that he serve adult beverages. For the last session, it might attract a lot more people. But that's all right. It's Friday. Our next speaker is my coworker, Rob Bogert. He's our engineering service line manager, and he's going to be discussing considerations in removal and replacement of AFFF.
Thanks, Alan. And where's the clicker here? And for those of you online, Alan's just joking. There's about 250 people here live, and we appreciate all of you. So we're going to be, like Alan said, I'm going to be talking about something that's a little bit off topic. I'm a remediation engineer, but this project really wasn't related to remediation. It was related to PFAS and AFFF. I won't give myself a plug. You can read about me in my bio online, but I wanted to point out my coworker who was instrumental in this process, Ashley Rose. He's the leader of our construction and field services. He and his team were largely responsible for the work that you'll see in my last few slides. And again, I'm with MSE Group, work with Alan. We're part of the Montrose family. We're a full service consulting firm. But we also have sister companies that do treatment system design, and we do in-house laboratory testing. After that shameless plug, I'll talk a little bit about the history. This is somewhat redundant with some of the other talks that we've had. We heard that this was discovered accidentally way back in the 30s, first used commercially in the 40s. AFFF wasn't created until 1966 and then later used in 1970. From the 70s through the 90s was a relatively quiet period for PFAS and AFFF. However, there was back in that period some concern raised about the environmental issues, but it wasn't really until 2000 that we started seeing changes in manufacturing with PFOS and PFOA being downsized, particularly in the United States. I believe it's still manufactured in other parts of the world, but it's not currently made in the United States. Recognizing this issue, the DoD revised their military specification for AFFF. I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail, to lower or establish a limit, I should say, for the amount of PFOS and PFOA that can be in AFFF. That was issued in 2016. And then starting in 2018, the major branches of the military started a voluntary replacement of AFFF to remove what's referred to as the legacy AFFF, the mil-spec material before 2016. And that work was recently completed by all branches of the DoD. And something else I wanted to point out was the military specification goes beyond just Department of Defense. The Federal Aviation Authority, FAA, up until this year was required to use AFFF, the military specification blend. They're currently evaluating options to use, and that's part of federal law right now for them to come up with a new alternative. From about, well, as far back as I went for the past 20 years or so, PFAS and AFFF aren't really mentioned in DoD spending bills up until I think the first mention was 2019, maybe one reference to PFAS. In 2020, the National Defense Authorization Act, there were multiple references to PFAS. In that act, which is something that's issued every year, it's what funds the DoD. In 2020, there were 172 PFAS chemicals added to the EPA's toxic release inventory. This formally established that the fluorine-free foam was going to be needed in the future for as a replacement for AFFF. It's kind of a bad acronym. AFFF, a fluorine-free foam, is completely different than AFFF, which is, I struggle with this all the time, aqueous film-forming foam. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but the fluorine-free foam, good. AFFF, good. AFFF, not so good. But this also required it to be phased out by 2024. And more importantly, it ceased all operations of testing of the system. So there was no more live testing. They use other methods so that they don't have releases while they're testing their systems. And there are additional changes, but the most recent one, which was actually, if everybody remembers, Schoolhouse Rock, and I'm just a bill. This bill became law. It was presidentially vetoed back in December, but passed with a congressional override of that veto, so it is now law. There's, Ellen mentioned at the beginning of the session, $1.4 billion set aside for cleanup of federal installations. The National Guard has access to DERP funds when it comes to cleanup. And if there's any of you that are innovators out there, some chemists who can come up with an AFFF alternative, there's up to a $5 million cash prize from the federal Uncle Sam to come up with an alternative. Other changes, there need to be reports formally filed to Congress on progress that is being made. It started the slide as to what is AFFF, but I think this audience knows what AFFF is, so I won't get into that. More of why is it used? Because it's effective. In the military specification, it's a performance spec. So it's not so much that they're putting in PFAS on, but it helps. It works. It's effective, and all blends of mil spec up until 2016 contained PFOS and PFAS. I'm sorry, PFOS and PFOA. It's film forming, meaning it puts a layer of film over the hydrocarbon substance, which is jet fuel, and it suffocates the flames. I know you can't read the chart that's on here, but this is just one manufacturer's different blends of AFFF. So one manufacturer has 30, 40 different varieties of AFFF based on its application and where it's supposed to go. There are only two on here that meet the mil spec requirement. And again, it's a performance specification. And that's a 6% variety and a 2% variety. And those percentages amount to how much concentrate should go in mixed with the water. So 3% is 3%. So it's 3% concentrate, 97% water. So mentioned that the mil spec and revisions, legacy AFFF, that before 2016, there wasn't a limitation on the amount of PFAS that could be in the foam. And it contained the longer chains, the C8s, which are carbon 8s, which we all know now as PFOS and PFOA are those type. The new blends only have C6 chains, the short chains. So there is no PFOS and PFOA in the concentrate. So why can you have 800 parts per billion, which is a fairly large number compared to environmental? Is because the manufacturing process will introduce some of those trace contaminants. I mean, it's at PPB, the definition of trace is a suspect when you have to treat down to 70 part per trillion. So it's not added, it's not present. It won't break down into PFOS and PFOA, but the military specification allows for some of this material to still exist in the formulation. And as I said, there are constantly experimenting and coming up with new formulas that can meet the performance spec of mil-spec and reduce the number of harmful chemicals. That said, this is just one manufacturer's mil-spec formulation. You'll see in bold, there's a couple proprietary solutions in there, meaning that it's not public knowledge, but they do have perfluorinated surfactants still in the modern AFFF. It's just the shorter chains. And if you look in 40 CFR, there are requirements for how that material must be disposed. And I think we've talked about all three types. Incineration is one. If you're going to incinerate, 1,000 degrees Celsius must be reached based on these two components in here. And that's the legal requirement. It's, you know, I think we heard numbers lower that they'll break down at 500 centigrade and some other, but that's what the incinerator has to operate. Deep well injection is legally allowed. Our client, private client, did not want to consider that option. We were only left with options for incineration or landfill bulking and then landfill. So our project was actually replacing the AFFF material that created before 2016, manufactured before 2016, and still in place. We did work at 2 different facilities, 6 different aircraft hangars, replaced foam in 30 tanks, upwards of 12,000 gallons of AFFF concentrate. And the cleaning process, we generated a little over 9,000 gallons of rinsate. So there's a lot of things that we had to consider when we started this project. First and foremost is that not all the systems are alike. So there's 2 main types of systems. There's the open atmosphere type, which just means that the AFFF is at atmospheric pressure. And there's closed systems, bladder tanks, where the AFFF itself is under pressure from water surrounding a rubber bladder. And it just affects how it's delivered. It affects the mechanical equipment you're going to be contacting and touching, and it just changes how you're approaching. Common issues are related to handling. There's special pumps that should be used when handling AFFF. They're centrifugal pumps, but they have a lower shear. They help keep the material from foaming. You don't want to remove this stuff and create, 100 times the volume you started with. That would be bad. There's defoamer that you add to the AFFF that helps you minimize the production of foam. And sometimes you can find an oil layer that's some manufacturers recommend that a food grade oil is placed at the top of the tanks. That's really nothing more than a dust protection or debris protection to keep anything from getting into the tanks, settling to the bottom and being sucked into the fire protection system and causing problems. One crucial step is at large facilities, there's going to be alarm systems in place. Those alarm systems, when triggered, could set off the foam system. So when we're working and changing the product out, we don't want to set off the system. Our client did not want us to spill, I think one said that they don't want us to spill a teaspoon of AFFF. So we were very patient in our planning. We did an inspection weeks before we mobilized, tried to identify any problems, write down all the details we could about the types of equipment, down to the mechanical couplings used, and I'll get to why we did that in a little bit. Valves and seals are a concern. While these systems are regularly maintained, they have to be by law. The seals around the valves and pipe, they don't get exercised. I mean, they're mechanical fittings. You torque them down to the specification, you leave them alone. Well, in order to clean them properly, we have to take it apart. And when you take it apart, these rubber Viton seals, they can deform. So putting them back together, you might not get a good fit. I think I'm on time, so should be able to finish. I just got the the 7-minute warning, and we got the Jack Bauer 24-hour clock in front of me. So. And the other thing is the tanks. There's nothing special about the tanks. They're just polyethylene tanks. In most cases, the bladder tanks are a little bit more complicated. But when we did our pre-inspection, we noticed that some of the tanks around them had looked like some seal had been added to keep the integrity. So we're a little bit worried about the tanks leaking after we took them apart and cleaned them out. So we went ahead and bought a standby tank to have on ready in case we couldn't get a good seal. One of the biggest concerns we had to worry about, we want these systems to be down for a short of a period of time. The environmental issues with the foam can't impact the day-to-day operations of the aircraft. So the alarm lockout was crucial. Emptying and cleaning the tanks took us about, it would take us about an hour or so to completely evacuate a tank, but then this tank had to be cleaned. So you're adding water, which doesn't mix really well with AFFF, so you're washing down the tanks. Got to make sure the tank's completely dry. So we used blowers to force out as much of the rinse aid as we could. But then we needed an overnight drying to ensure that the last bits of moisture had been removed. Cleaning the delivery piping was proved a little bit more complicated. Like I said, we made sure we had the right mechanical fittings on site because we had a suspicion that those would leak. So we replaced all the mechanical O-rings just as a matter of caution because we wanted to minimize downtime. The pipes we had to triple rinse 100% of the volume, but being smaller volume pipes, it only contributed about 20% of it. And of course, we had to contain the rinse aid for disposal. Some of these photos just show the process. That was the brand new tank that we brought in. Didn't need it the first time, needed it the second time. We ended up having a tank that we could not meet tightness, but fortunately we had a spare, so we could do that offline. And for precaution, we went ahead and ordered another one, which we didn't end up needing, but it was a $3,000 tank versus a several weeks of downtime for our client. So it was money well spent. Reassembly and refill, it's a simple, reverse the steps you just did, get the alarm system back up, and get out of your client's hair. All of our waste was incinerated. We did have an option for bulk landfill bulking. At the time, the client as well as us thought that incineration was the better option. For the rinse aid, if we had to do things again, I would say we would probably look to on-site treatment options. We had about 9,000 gallons of rinse aid split between two different sites, two different mobilizations. So we were dealing about 4,500 gallons each time we did this. It's a small volume relatively, so getting the price point to be effective for bringing in a remediation system versus sending it off-site with the concentrate, it was the main issue there. But since we did these projects, there's been advancements in advancements as well as increased availability in treatment systems. So if we had to do this project all over and again today, we would probably go with the treatment. I'll close by saying, if we have to go back and redo this project, and all the stuff that has been put in throughout all the DoD facilities is still AFFF. While it's a much better blend of AFFF than the legacy stuff before 2016, it does not meet the military's current plan to use a non-fluorine foam. So that's going to have to be handled over the next several years, and it's a lot of military installations. I didn't find good records for everything, but there's been over 3 million gallons of foam that have been disposed. At least 1 million of it's been incinerated. Not clear on how the other 2 million was disposed, but you can imagine that a lot of it's going to incinerators. I'll close with again another shameless plug. ECT2, our sister company that did the presentation here, has on-site treatment options that could handle the rinsate. They're not appropriate for the concentrate. That still needs to be incinerated due to legal and client requirements. And I'll see any remaining time I may have, and we'll wait for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for your informative presentation. Our next presentation, there's actually been a change from your agenda. It's still case studies for selecting a PFAS treatment approach in drinking water, but our presenters are going to be Aaron Getchell and Lori Kappen. They will be online.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll get started. Happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for sitting in on our presentation. I'm Aaron Getchell, and this afternoon, Lori Kappen will be presenting 3 case studies for selecting PFAS treatment approach in drinking water. Next slide, please. Time to pay some bills with a slide about Gannett Fleming. But while you are reading this, I would like to sincerely thank the PFAS Forum Steering Committee for allowing us to present today and for Gannett Fleming to be a silver sponsor for this important conference. Next slide, please. Today, I will be providing this brief introduction, and Lori Kappen will be presenting 3 case studies of designing PFAS treatment systems for large water supply systems that are contaminated with PFAS. Next slide, please. Lori and I have worked together on a large nationwide PFAS project, and I can tell you that Lori knows PFAS. We also contribute to a small internal PFAS working group that Gannett Fleming started about 3 years ago to stay ahead of developing regulations and to serve as an internal resource to support our engineering, environmental, and compliance practitioners. These 3 case studies are just 3 of the many large drinking water systems that Lori has worked on since 2015 to mitigate PFAS contamination. And with that, kindly give Lori your attention. Lori?
Thank you. I have to say it's kind of odd to have you pass it on to me and hear no applause. Okay, so I understand you've probably seen a lot of this already so I'm not really going into too much detail here, but as you can see, PFAS is a nationwide issue. There are areas where it has been detected more, although I have to probably refresh everybody's memory that that's really more because that's where they've been looking for it yet. A lot of these other places have not necessarily, done the same level of analysis as some states. So, and more recently, as the military has been looking at their bases and their sites, there's been an increasing number of areas where it's been detected. I would expect that this is going to continue to increase moving forward as more and more areas are tested for PFAS. Again, since I'm focusing on really, drinking water aspects of this, there are a number of states who have already passed their own state standards. Some are just setting it at the federal, health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion. Some are setting it lower, including, significantly lower, in the range of, less than 20 parts per trillion. And there are a number of states that have initiated PFAS regulations within drinking water or in groundwater, which obviously impacts drinking water. So again, it's likely to continue to increase as states and the federal government move forward with this. So again, I expect you all to memorize this. I will give you a quiz at the end. No, just to highlight again, there's such a wide variety right now of how states are choosing to regulate this. and at what levels, just depending on various, research that they've done, their comfort level with safety factors, et cetera. So and a lot of these numbers are pretty close to the detection level for some of these. So they're basically regulating it at the level that you can even detect that it's there. So it leads to some challenging treatment possibilities here, just because you are trying to remove it to such low levels. Federal elections, again, I understand you probably have all been through this already, so I'm not really going to cover this in a lot of detail. I did just want to pick out, that the federal government is moving forward with this. In February of this year, there was a final regulatory determination that 2 of these PFASs will be regulated. And in March, the 5th UCMR base requirements came out. So from 2023 to 2025, there will be a nationwide analysis of 29 more PFASs in drinking water. So again, as more data continues to come out, as they understand what's there, and the research on health effects comes forward, we will continue to see more of this. Okay, so going through, as far as PFAS in general, in particular, PFOA and PFOS have really been the 2 primary agents that have been focused, just because those are the ones that have the federal health advisory levels set for them. But and for various compounds, this is going to vary a little bit, because they have different adsorption properties. But so moving forward, we're really focusing primarily on PFOA and PFOS. But in general, these will all hold true no matter what you're trying to treat. Obviously, you need to consider primarily the effectiveness of your treatment technology when you are trying to select one. Figure out what works for your specific water quality, because that will strongly impact some selection in your adsorption media. You want to keep in mind, whether there's a long track record of performance or whether this is a relatively new technology, and what existing treatment process you have there, and how what you select is going to play with that. Obviously, if you have specific site constraints, there may be elevations on your site that are more or less conducive to putting in a certain treatment process. There may be space constraints where there's not a lot of room to put in new infrastructure. Zoning limits, height limits on what you can build. So all of those can play into a decision on what makes sense for a site. There is obviously head loss treatment process here. So there will likely need to be an increase in the pumping head that you're pumping across. You're going to have to evaluate the best way to do that, whether that is changing out well pumps to increase pressure, or whether you need to add additional pumping somewhere. And so the pressure losses through this treatment process may impact your decision on how you want to go, depending on how that affects your need to change out pumps or add pumping. Another thing you want to look at is obviously how much waste is going to be generated. How are you going to dispose of it? What's the cost involved with that? What's the infrastructure involved in providing the washing supply, and then disposing of that wash supply, as well as the media that you've absorbed this material onto. Obviously, cost is always a big impact, and some of the factors that play into that are the construction costs, but both the ongoing operating costs in terms of power, media replacement, maintenance, those types of things, and permitting requirements, especially when you've got something moving as rapidly as this, where you need to decide and implement a treatment process pretty rapidly. How this is permitted in your state will strongly affect the choices that you make. So we're going to step through some of these in more detail, and in particular in context with various projects that we have done designing and selecting some treatment processes. So conventional treatment alternatives, and I say that because these are the ones that have been fairly well established to work and have been in treatment processes for a relatively long time, whether they've been used for PFAS or not. Two large groups is an adsorption technology. You adsorb it onto some sort of a solid media where it's removed from the water and transferred over to some sort of media, usually granular activated carbon or an anion exchange resin. Powdered activated carbon will work too, but there are cost impacts to using powdered activated carbon instead of a granular activated carbon. But the other, there are filtration options. They're limited because you have to have very small pores to remove that. So it's kind of limited to like a reverse osmosis or nanofiltration, which in some instances where you're treating water and you already have that type of process in, either in an industrial type treatment or for some specific treatment purpose, then those will remove PFAS, and they are absolutely an opportunity if you've already got that or you have a need for it. Generally, though, if you don't have another need for those processes, you know, your adsorption technologies are going to be the most cost effective for most facilities. So those are really the processes that we are going to be focusing on moving forward. I did want to alternatives. There's a lot of research in this right now. There's electrochemical oxidation processes, foam fractionation, aggressive redox, and incineration, of course, is also a treatment alternative. These type things have some benefits in that some of them will actually deteriorate the PFAS and they're more of a long-term solution for getting rid of them. Some of them are just taking it from a low dilution to a more concentrated solution that makes this easier. But most of these are not going to be very cost effective at the concentrations in drinking water or drinking water sources. But they are a really good opportunity for further treating waste from those processes, either, you know, in a way to more ultimately dispose of the concentrated PFAS solution or the media, to either repurpose the media or just fully get rid of that PFAS. So as I mentioned, you know, there's really two primary adsorption technologies. One is activated carbon, and that has been used in water treatment for a very long time. It's fairly well known as far as even how well it absorbs the PFAS and what some of the impacts are in there. Resin, you know, anion-exchange resin, ion resins have been around for a while, but their effectiveness in removing the various PFASs was a little less well established as this started to come out as something that needed treated as they were developing these regulatory levels. Over the past, you know, 2 or 3 years, there's really been a huge build in information and data on the effectiveness of the resins. So that's becoming an increasingly can't even think of the right word. Increasingly a process that's looking attractive to various people depending on their site specific needs. And a couple of the reasons which I'm illustrating on here are because of the footprint that these take up. They are able to remove PFAS to low levels for a long period of time due to their adsorption properties. And so they're able to do that with a much smaller volume of media that needs to absorb that and with much higher loading rates. And that translates to smaller treatment process units and a smaller footprint. And that smaller footprint can also translate to cost savings in constructing the building to put this on. If you need to purchase a site, you know, that takes less land. So that does translate into certain benefits. So some other site considerations, and this is a couple rough layouts that we had done for one site, where in one option we were looking at the need to put in a clear well after the treatment process so that you could pump straight through this treatment process and then go to a clear well and further pump into the system. That may be the best option, either where it's not feasible to change out the well pump to increase the head going through the treatment process, or if the pressure in your system is so high that it's not practical to pump all the way from the well through the process into the system at that higher pressure. So, but that obviously affects the cost of comparing the options, because you now have to build an extra water storage tank somewhere to provide that system equalization and a place to pump the water out of. So those are site specific considerations depending on the pressures that you are operating. Some ancillary facilities that may be required. And this is an example from one of our sites that was using GAC, and they had a very limited sewer capacity to discharge their waste to. So the GAC was backwashed some periodically as needed to restore head as head loss built through that. So there's a backwash waste equalization tank that goes into that system. It's then pumped from there at a low rate into the sewer system, so they're not overloading the sewer. There's also an influent wet well, which was needed just to capture water from their aeration facility, which was then pumped through this new treatment process, and a treated water storage from which it is transferred back over to their high service pumping system to transfer into the distribution system at this site. So those are some additional facilities that were needed to facilitate this particular treatment process. Ion exchange resin is smaller, has a significantly less smaller backwash volume. So this backwash waste equalization can potentially be reduced for sites that do need that because of their waste disposal options. So that's a consideration in selecting a treatment process. There's also site considerations that you need to think of from other perspectives. In this case, this is one client where their facilities, their 2 wells that are going to have treatment added are located in a local ballpark. So they obviously are concerned about minimizing the amount of space that they are using for this treatment process, but also some of the aesthetics involved. They also need to consider, livery trucks coming up and down these gravel parking lots. Trying to minimize that is something they want to do, because they don't even own this land. They lease this from the township. Obviously, the township has an incentive to make sure that this treatment occurs, but you want to work with them and try to minimize the impacts that that's going to have on the public as they're using this ball field. Comparing some design parameters. This is a recent evaluation we did for installation at a treatment facility. This one's in New Jersey. So looking at the flow rates that we did, sorry about that. They had, if you were using GAC, based on the water quality parameters, they were recommending a surface loading rate of about 7.7 gallons a minute per square foot for a GAC treatment, and only 2.7, or sorry, and a higher loading rate of 10.2 gallons a minute per square foot for the resin treatment option. So with that higher loading rate, you could use only 2 treatment trains if you were using some sort of an ion exchange resin, whereas you would use 3 treatment trains to be able to treat the whole process with a GAC contactor. The empty bed contact time per vessel for the GAC is also higher. It's 12 minutes in the GAC options and only slightly under 3 minutes for the resin options. And that leads to a significant height difference in the vessels of about 27 feet for the GAC vessels. And sorry about that. Somehow that disappeared from my table, but it was about 16, 17 feet for the resin ones. And that kind of height can make a big difference in the building cost that you need to build a superstructure around these for shelter, because a 20 foot, 25, 30 feet ceiling or even higher to provide some clearance on there adds a lot to the building cost. So that's a consideration there. And you'll see that the bed volumes for breakthrough, the GACs based on manufacturer projections of how long, it was about 50 to 60,000 bed volumes of water treated through the resin or through the GAC before it would break through. Whereas with the resin options, you were getting much higher bed volumes. However, keeping in mind that the beds for the resin are about 3 times smaller than the GAC, you end up actually having fairly comparable change out frequencies. So with each of those, you're looking at a change out frequency of about every 1,000 to 1,300 days. So about every 3-4 years, you need to change out this media. It's a higher volume of GAC that needs changed out, but on a volume basis per cubic foot, GAC is less expensive. So it ends up almost balancing out in terms of the media replacement costs. And that's sort of reflected here, where the little higher for the resin, depending on the resin, to some degree, significantly more, whereas some of the GAC versus resin replacement costs are fairly comparable depending on what you would select in this case. The resin power costs are a little higher because you do get more head loss through those operating at the higher flow rates. You have more wastewater disposal costs with the GAC because you do need to backwash those more thoroughly. As a natural product, you get some loose GAC in there, some GAC powder when it's delivered, and that needs to be backwashed off of there so it's thoroughly clean before you place it into service. The resin does not have that to the same degree, so there's a little bit of rinsing that gets done with that when it's first installed, but it's not the same volume of wastewater. There is a cartridge filter changeout cost. So those are for filters upstream of these that remove small particulate matter so that doesn't clog up your treatment process. And ultimately, you can see that in this case, the life cycle costs, for as far as the operating costs was fairly comparable between the two, a little bit higher for the resin. But ultimately, the resin costs ended up being lower because of the construction costs, not only for the system itself, but also then for the superstructure and pumping facilities that you need to construct around that. So that's in this case, that's where the cost played out. You end up with a slightly lower anticipated cost if you go with a resin option. Pilot testing, GAC, a rapid small scale column test is commonly used for that, and that can give at least a reasonable estimate of comparison between carbons. It may not give you a completely accurate representation of the long-term performance, but if you're just comparing different GACs, that can give you a pretty good idea of which ones will work better. Resins, you can't really do a rapid small scale column test with them because of the impact on them. If they're ground into a fine powder, it changes the properties, and that's not going to be representative of full scale performance. If you do need to do a pilot test, initially most states were requiring pilot tests because it's a new technology. They want to verify how it's going to perform, as well as any other side effects that it may have on the water quality that could impact things like corrosion control. As that data becomes available for multiple sources, for multiple resins, that the need for pilot testing is going down as governments and regulators develop a comfort level with this resin, and as that data becomes available. So we really can understand how it will perform without necessarily needing to run a long pilot test. This is an example of a recent pilot test that was done. This was comparing 3 resins. Each resin there you can see has sort of 4 columns. That just allows a simple form of grabbing samples at various points in this, so you can test at different empty bed contact times, and it also lets you monitor the process through the column, so you can kind of see how it's going through the column, and when you've reached that steady state as far as how it's moving through there. Because in that first column, you can usually see that it goes through faster, and as it gets through these longer bed times, it starts to stabilize as far as how many bed volumes it needs to reach until it gets the breakthrough point. A key thing that you need to be aware of, and by this point you probably are, but anion exchange resin, not every resin is going to perform the same for every water quality. Similarly, the same is true for GAC, so you want to make sure that you have a GAC that's been proven effective to work for PFAS specifically. In this case, you can see that we tested, in this case, 3 resins. One of them started to break through about half the bed volume, slightly less than half the bed volumes of the other 2. And when that was observed, the client decided to go ahead and just stop testing. They decided that the other 2 were showing that they were more effective in this case. So they continued testing on the other 2. And those had a much longer bed volume. So one of them went up to about 180,000 bed volumes before there was a low level breakthrough. And the other one, by the time they stopped testing at about 260,000 bed volumes, still had not shown breakthrough through that final column. I do want to point out that bed volumes, and you kind of saw that previously, is not necessarily exactly equivalent to how frequently you need to change it out, because when you have a GAC contactor with an empty bed contact time of 10 minutes, that gives you that gives you like a 10,000 gallon volume versus, you know, a 3-minute empty bed contact time. You know, you may have a 3,000 gallon bed volume. So, you know, if you're treating a certain flow rate at 1,000 gallons a minute, you know, you're going to get about, 19,000 bed volumes from the GAC, but you know, you end up treating about the same total volume through there before you actually need to replace it, even though it's a much shorter bed volumes for the GAC. So I want to note some other water quality parameters that will impact the effectiveness of GAC and anion exchange. For the organics that will impact that, in particular anions, nitrate and sulfate are 2 big ones. Some other anions will also impact that. If they're absorbed onto the ion resin, it will decrease how well that it will be able to absorb PFAS because they're just competing anions. Other inorganics that can affect us, if the water is hard water, or if there's iron and manganese in there that's dissolved, that can precipitate out as water goes through these treatment units, either anion exchange or GAC, and you need to be careful to control that. Otherwise, that will end up precipitating out in the filter in this adsorption unit, and that will reduce the effectiveness. So that's a consideration going through this process. In the organics, most of the resins don't absorb most of the kind of natural organic matter or VOCs, SOCs, but GAC will absorb it. And that's again a consideration. If you have a lot of VOCs in the water, your GAC will absorb it, which is great for removing VOCs, but that uses up your adsorption capacity, and then you end up breaking through with PFASs much more rapidly. Another just minor consideration is that, you know, where there's radon in groundwater, the GAC will absorb the radon. It's a great treatment benefit. It doesn't really impact how well it will remove the PFAS, but you do have to be aware that as it's removing radon, it does get concentrated, and at the end, the GAC may have a low-level radioactive level in it that you just have to kind of wait and allow that radioactivity to dissipate somewhere before it can be disposed of, just so that it's not a radioactive waste. An example in one facility that we've recently did an evaluation on, they had an existing treatment process where they, you know, pumped through an air stripper to remove VOCs. Then it went to a reservoir and then pumped out to the distribution system. So we looked at 2 possible locations to install this new treatment process for PFAS, and you know, one was to place it basically after the air stripper, and one was to place it before the air stripper. If you place it before the air stripper, the GAC will remove your VOCs very effectively, which is great, except that when it's removing all those VOCs, they're using up the adsorption sites, and you suddenly aren't absorbing your PFAS very well. So talking with the vendors, their models, you know, estimated, you know, about a 2-year life for your GAC to need replaced when it's placed downstream of the air stripper. If they wanted to place it upstream of the air stripper, you get about 2 months of life before your PFAS start to break through. So you want, it sounds great to use this GAC. You can get rid of your air stripper, you can remove your VOCs and your PFAS all in one treatment process. Not a great idea if you're trying to remove PFAS specifically just because of the impact that you have. So that's something to be aware of as you're going through existing treatment processes, how that's going to integrate into your process. A quick slide on waste handling. You're all aware now that once you have gotten this PFAS out of the drinking water, it doesn't just go away, it's still there. It's, you know, if you're using an adsorption process, it's absorbed onto the media. You then need to figure out how to safely dispose of that media. In general, for now, you know, the primary way is to just incinerate the media with the PFAS. And I think that was just discussed in the presentation before here. If you incinerate it properly, it generally destroys the PFAS. There is still some research being done into that, but that's generally kind of an accepted method. GAC can actually be regenerated, and tests have shown that does eliminate the PFAS, and it, you know, you can destroy the PFAS and reuse the GAC. So for large facilities, that's definitely a potential cost-effective way to handle that. If you would use something like a reverse osmosis or nanofiltration, you end up with a concentrated PFAS waste that is usually able to be addressed basically by then sending that concentrated waste through a much smaller GAC bed or an anion exchange bed. So you do transfer that to a solid media where that can be then incinerated or otherwise disposed of. I did mention earlier some of these newer technologies that are looking at ways of breaking down this PFAS. Those are, you know, potential future ways of handling this waste that also will destroy the PFAS. So I don't know if I left enough time for questions or not. But I do want to say thanks, and our contact information is here in case you did have any questions and wanted to follow up with us. So thank you all for your attention. I appreciate that. If there are any questions, let me know.
Lori, we're doing questions at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So thank you,
right.
Lori and Aaron, for your time and sharing your data. What I've kind of observed is a lot of the science that's being presented is similar, which means we have great engineers working on these projects. Our next presenter is Barry Zibelman. Did I get that right? Yep. All right. With Onion Equipment, and he's going to be presenting on PFAS treatment journey.
Well, I'm one of the last speakers, so there's not going to be any charts, no formulas. We're just going to talk about my past 5 years, and actually the term should be diversity of what we've seen in the sites over the past 5 years. All right, in the beginning, we were asked to do 2 systems in Oceania. At that time, 5 years ago, carbon was the state of the art. And we were treating, both systems were about 100 GPM. One was a wastewater outfall, and the other one was a drinking water system. And even though there were actually 2 bases, one was for the drinking water and one was for the outfall, they were only 100 feet apart. So they were very close and very easy to operate. Turns out that the wastewater system we were changing out every quarter. So the carbon was being exhausted very quickly. 2 years into the process, ion exchange became recognized as a potential treatment. 3.5 years into the process, we finally got the Air National Guard, in this case, to switch over. And they still have not done a change out after we put the ion exchange media in. So that was a good example of how the ion exchange media was able to last a lot longer, handle the concentrations, and still keep us down to non-detect. Well, then the next side I was asked to do, I felt like Mikey, give it to Barry, he'll figure out a way to do it. I sat down with a couple of friends, engineers, and we literally did this design on a napkin. So how do you get rid of 1 million parts per trillion of PFAS with human waste inside? What happened was one of the hangers, the AFFF container leaked, got into the sanitary. They walk around the water treatment facility once an hour. They came out and all of a sudden there's 12 feet of foam at the facility. They shut down the facility very quickly, and as you can see, they pumped it into two clarifiers. We were told that we had 125,000 gallons of water to treat, so be prepared to treat that. Unfortunately, the engineer gave me cubic feet of water and said it was gallons, so we had 7.48 more gallons, almost 1 million gallons of water to treat, as opposed to 125,000 gallons to treat. And lucky for me, I priced it at $1 per gallon. So there were change orders involved on a continuous basis. And so again, I'm treating wastewater. I'm treating metals that came from the wash down from the hangar, organics. And lucky for me, I had just done EC work at a site in New Jersey. Electrocoagulation is using metal plates, running DC, and you oxidize just about everything. And what was very cool about that was we were able to take human waste, stinky smelling water. As it went through this small EC unit, it was only about this big, we were able to get clear water and with no odor. So we're able to oxidize and sterilize the water in a short distance. It happens to also take out all the metals and all the VOCs all at the same time. We created a flock, we put polymers in after that, and we were able to remove roughly 40% of the the PFAS, PFOA through that process. So when you're starting at 1 million, you drop it down 400,000 PPT. It was sort of a home run in our eyes. Then again, not knowing 100% how the EC would work, we wound up going through carbon to take out more VOCs. It turned out to be very effective at removing a lot of the PFAS initially, and then PFAS, PFOA, and then we used seven other ion exchange resin vessels to remove it down to below 70 PPT. One of the things that was also interesting about the EC though, it actually took the PFOA and converted it to PFAS, which was great for the media because it was much easier to absorb it. And it was to a tune of about 180,000. So we saw the decrease in the raw water of the PFOA converting over to PFAS. So that was just a sort of an interesting observation. And we were able to keep, for the most part, down to below 70 PPT. The one thing we did find though, which was, and it's in the documentation, but when you get really high concentrations, I'm going to mispronounce this, but it's called misomers. And it's where the PFAS, PFOA becomes a compound again, they actually combine again. And so your ion exchange and your carbon is really not effective because what we saw is we got through the 5th vessel and the concentrations actually remained the same. And it wasn't all the time, but it was occurring and it was making the Naval Air Station a little bit upset. So because they wanted that 70. And so what we wound up doing is we used a filter used in the nuclear industry, and we took out the rest of the compounds from that. So it was again, second major project, and we had a bunch of lessons just from that. The last all the way on the right, you can see what we wound up treating at the very end, and that was a sludgy material where we just separated out the water as best possible. And then they wound up disposing it after that. So this is a site in Boulder, Colorado, Boulder Heights. We had a volunteer fire department that was given a tote of AFFF, but they didn't have any firefighting equipment. No foam equipment, but they had a tote. In 1995, it was a volunteer fire department. They decided to dump it on the ground, the whole tote. And the volunteer fire department at Boulder Heights is at the top of the hill. And so all the wells down gradient, all the homeowners down gradient wound up getting their dose of PFAS, and they dumped it in 95. The first homeowner that contacted me lived about 50 yards from where they dumped it. When I got to her place, she was still drinking 800 PPT of PFAS, and that was over, so it had been 4 years ago. All those years she was drinking that water. And when we did the analysis, we found out that her water was also radioactive. So when we put our system in, and she had no cancers, which was amazing. But we wound up taking out the PFAS and taking out the radiation, uranium. It was actually uranium that she was, light doses of uranium she was drinking. So that was my next system. Again, different problems. You have just totally different set of problems, including uranium. All right. So we've been lucky enough to be able to get exposed to treating ponds. We have 2 active systems. One's at Peterson Air Force Base, which is irrigating the golf course for the generals. and the other is Stewart Air National Guard in New York. The initial site in Peterson, the irrigation wells were taking the water from the bottom of the pond. So we were always getting new algae and things like that. But, so part of my decision process initially was just to load up with particulate filters and use 5-micron bags, which they were changing all the time. The system consisted of first carbon, because we had VOCs coming off the runways, and then the contaminated water coming from the old fire testing area. And so we used the carbon where we backwash or take the VOCs out. And we had the 5-micron filters. What we did know about 5-micron filters is that worm eggs pass through a 5-micron filter. So all of a sudden, our carbon vessels got loaded up with worms, something you never expect. And so we wound up having to take out that. We wound up actually going to sand filtration. And then eventually, you can see that we wound up bringing a floating pump in there. And we were no longer sucking from the bottom. We were no longer getting worm eggs that were settling from the bottom, no more algae. And on both cases, it improved it dramatically. With Stewart, though, we did the startup in December. They initially said design it for 300 GPM. They said no, bump it up to 500 GPM. We started up in December. They had a 100-year rain event, snow event, and we wound up not only getting 3,000 gallons per minute passing by. This little clear pond became the muddy Mississippi. They were changing all the filters every 4 hours. And we wound up getting a dose of glycol, which gummed up everything in the system. So we weren't prepared for it. We didn't have any. They didn't even know they were getting that stream from one of the airfields that they didn't know it was connected at the time. If you look at the upper left-hand side of the picture, you're looking at a 500 GPM system that we can put in a land sea container. We had 3 containers out there. They're preheated, pre-vented, so they can handle all temperature conditions. We're known for, this is our plug, we're known for making small systems up to 500 GPMs in land sea containers or portable systems for dewatering. We're doing a 3-year project at Cherry Point now for, they're doing a 3-mile trench for new utilities. And so our trail is just tagging along with that. And again, we have sand filters in that system. All right, this is a site you may have heard of from one of my past discussions. Cannon Air Force Base, Clovis, New Mexico. The site wells right before these dairy farms had 25,000 PPT of PFAS. The first irrigation well across the road from the base had 14,000 PPT. Turns out that the water that they were feeding the cattle with had 1,700 PPT, and the cow's milk had 700 PPT. I was the one who had to tell the farmer that he couldn't sell his milk anymore. And he goes, "Why?" And I go, "Your liabilities were going to be, much more than losing your farm." And he goes, "Well, can I sell the beef?" And so then we had to go sample the beef to see if he could even, it was all. So CDC, don't ask me why CDC has a 400 PPT reg on PFAS in food. Don't ask me how CDC came out with that, but that's CDC, not the Food and Drug or contaminated, controlling what's in your food stream. What was really even sad was this was organic milk. So what you're looking at here before he decided to drop it, he was disposing of 8,000 to 12,000 gallons of milk a day, and he wound up disposing of 4,500 head of cattle because he couldn't sell it, and so he wound up losing the farm. We wound up, other of the dairy farmers in the area got very concerned. We started sampling all the silage, the wheat. And what was very interesting is, it was just the opposite of some of the cases in Maine, is that PFAS in the irrigation water didn't uptake into the plants. So all the feed, and I tested, I don't know, 15 different silages, and none of the silages had any detectable levels of PFAS in the feed. So the cows were not getting any PFAS from what they're eating. They were getting it from strictly the water. In the Maine study, and it's been published a couple of years ago now by the Maine Department of Environment, they were using biosolids contaminated with PFAS, and the plants just sucked that right up and wound up contaminating the cows that way. It wasn't from the water. So that if somebody wants to do a paper on that and get a master's degree, that'd be a great master's or PhD on how PFAS is uptake in plants versus not uptake in the water. So we have 4 systems now out there. Cannon still does not have a system on their site. And so that's, we actually sold a system to Joint Base McLeod, Lakehurst McLeod in New Jersey. It was one of our most successful projects. We operated the system for 2 weeks and the water was clear, non-detect. So they just sampled wrong at some point, had a cross-contaminated sample. So that system's been sitting there for 2 years, not operating because the water is not clear. Oops. I thought there was one more. Oh, anyway, so that's, we have over 20 systems operating right now. Every one of these systems are different. We pretty much are going to hybrid systems where we're using carbon first, and the carbon we can use for backwashing. We're getting everything down to 5 microns. If we're treating ponds and streams, we're using strictly sand filters, so we can backwash those. The carbon does a lot of the lifting, but the ion exchange keeps us going we're up to about 350,000 bed volumes in one job right now. And it seems to be most cost effective for us at this point. So, thank you.
Thank you, Barry. That was kind of fascinating. My sister actually has a cattle ranch in Clovis, New Mexico. So I might have to share your story with her. It's actually in Portales, but it's not too far away. She lives in Clovis, works at Cannon Air Force Base. So our last presenter will also be virtually Robert Martin. And he's going to be presenting on thermal desorption solution for PFAS.
Good afternoon, everybody. Am I heard?
Yes, you are.
All right, thank you. Is the presentation up?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. All right. Again, Rob Martin, I want to thank everybody for being there. I have to admit, was a little concerned when I heard there was 250 people sitting there in the room earlier, but we're gonna forge ahead. What I'm presenting on today is Clean Earth at a facility in upstate New York performed a research development demonstration study on PFAS contaminated soil. And just go over top of the highlights associated with it. Quick little outline. We'll just briefly go over the thermal desorption technology and what it is. Quick little bit on the Fort Edward facility where the treatment was completed, how the opportunity came to us, and what the results of that testing ended up being, and then where Clean Earth is presently with our efforts associated with PFAS treatment. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions here at the end of the presentation. So direct fired thermal desorption is a technology that Clean Earth employs at the Fort Edward location. Very simple process description is we take media, solid media typically, heat it to a point at which we boil or desorb the contaminants from that media. And then we leave the media post such heating and treatment as an uncontaminated material that can be beneficially reused at various sites, either at that particular project location or other sites offsite. And then the desorbed contaminants, which we have boiled from the process, we thermally oxidize to take in, reduce, or destroy the contaminants which are in the process effluent stream. For those who like pictures and are interested in a little bit of a depiction of what the technology actually is, which you should be seeing as a process flow diagram for our equipment operations. Just a couple quick points that I'll point out here. The primary treatment unit itself, or rotary drum dryer, is the only part of the process that actually takes and manages or treats the media, contaminated soil in this particular instance. The rest of the components associated with the system are in place to control emissions, or are the air pollution control systems. From such technology and such equipment, we really only end up with two effluent streams, those being the soil, which ends up coming out at the end of the process, which has all of the fines that are generated within the process re-entrained or commingled back, and then our process effluent air, which is exhausted post an ID fan on the backside of a bag house. This particular technology setup is what's considered a hot configuration for thermal desorption units. That being the airstream stays warm through the process just prior to arriving at the bag house. So any of the contaminants that are desorbed in the primary unit stay, we'll call it relatively warm or hot, until they end up going through our secondary treatment or thermal oxidation. Picture of our Fort Edward facility. This is in upstate New York. And by upstate New York, I mean the area up by the Adirondack Park. For those of you who may be familiar with Lake George, we're not too awful far from the Lake George region, but this gives you a little better idea of what the facility layout actually is, and in particular, potentially how the components are actually set and how they intermix with one another as far as the process itself goes. So we'll get into a little bit about capacities, because capacities come into play a little bit in relation to the amount of soil we were actually granted to treat here along with the process. Primary treatment unit, again, the rotary drum dryer. We have the ability to treat up to 65 tons an hour of contaminated soils. Retention times, you'll see there, is roughly 6 to 10 minutes within a process, and we have the ability to get the soils up to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit from a treatment standpoint. Though at that temperature, we actually do not degrade the soil matrix itself. It does retain most of its original properties. The only thing that may occur is some degradation in the grain size of material, depending on what the matrix itself is. Our secondary treatment unit itself for our thermal oxidation processes, you can see there it's a relatively large burner. We have the ability to operate up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Our permitted temperatures at the facility is 1,512 degrees Fahrenheit. Wanted to list out a few, at least, general contaminants that we treat. So to give a little perspective of what the facility has the capability to do, we treat everything conventional fuels, coal tars, which up here make up about 70% of our business. We also have the ability to treat PCBs. So how this opportunity came about and was presented to Clean Earth. New York State, in investigating potential PFAS contamination at a property here in upstate New York, identified that there was a source associated with that property for PFAS contamination, and actually followed that source to an off-site location. At that off-site location, which I will speak to here shortly, the state decided that they were going to take and remove the soils from the property. It was a residential property where they had identified this location. The same time, New York State, as part of their PFAS response, had started to look at the leachates from all of the local landfills. So at that point in time, the landfills were not receiving or willing to accept any materials that had PFAS identified in the analyticals. So it, as has been discussed many points in time with this conference, limited the options that they had for the management of such soils. We Clean Earth ended up receiving a phone call from the Department of Environmental Remediation asking if we had or the ability to treat these compounds in soil. Discussions incurred since by permit, it's not a listed contaminant for our location, and through discussions with DER and DEC, who is the Department of Environmental Conservation, who actually oversees the permits for this location, worked through the state's RD&D process and ended up granting to Clean Earth registration in order to perform the treatment of the soils that the state had removed from the particular property. So a little bit about the soil itself. The soil was actually removed from a very large garden area on a property. You see here the soil composition, a little bit about that. Soil organic matter was very high, somewhere between 7 and a little over 10%. The particular location where the material had actually stemmed from was a composting facility. Part of their inbound source and what they used to produce some organic value within the soils was a de-inking sludge from a paper facility in the local area, which ended up being the source contaminant for the PFAS in the soils that were being managed at the location. One of the things we generally tend to look at from a thermal desorption standpoint in soils is BTU value. Generally, you tend to only see higher BTU values associated with highly contaminated materials. The BTU value associated with this material was actually stemming from that organic matter that was within the soil. So having a 900 BTUs per pound value, if you do some back numbers on what wood has for BTU, you come up with about that number, and that was really the basis for that BTU value. And moisture content, the material was relatively wet. From a facility standpoint, we tried to target 18% on a dry weight basis, this being 28%, so it's relatively high and takes additional energy within our system to manage just the moisture associated with the soils. The soil volume, and this is where really, if you remember back in the original slide, I said we could treat up to 65 tons an hour. The amount of soil that we had with this project ends up being a little over 22 tons, which for our facility relates to less than an hour of treatment, which was great for being able to do some work to try to demonstrate the ability for the technology to manage the contamination within the soil matrix, but it did not allow us the opportunity to perform any emissions testing on the oxidative system. For those who aren't familiar, performing that testing, the minimum time for a base run is 4 hours. If you're doing any sort of compliance testing, you have to do a minimum of 3 test runs. So it puts you at a base minimum of 12 hours of operation. In this particular situation, just didn't have the soil in order to do it. But from a company standpoint, we wanted to see if and learn whether the technology can manage the soil and remove the contaminants. So what our thoughts were as far as what we wanted to do. We thought based on the high organic matter, soil organic matter, that we were going to run and we should run our soil temperatures up relatively high. So prior to the test, we actually targeted a treatment temperature of 900 degrees Fahrenheit. And as is noted here, thought being the higher the temperature, the higher soil organic removal we should have. Our secondary treatment unit or thermal oxidation system, under the approval provided by the state, we had to operate the unit at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, I should have mentioned previously, but our thermal oxidative system here at the facility has a retention time of 2.1 seconds. So as has been mentioned, about 1000 degrees Fahrenheit. Here previously, EPA had some guidance documents at the time that said if you could maintain that temperature at a second, you should have adequate removal efficiencies. So the 1800 degrees and with the additional retention time in the system were adequate for the state to allow us to perform this test on, again, a relatively small amount of material over a very relatively short period of time. The objectives, what we were given for objectives, is that New York State has what they call their 21 list, PFAS compounds, in order for clean earth to be able to reutilize these soils under our beneficial use determination. We had to have a total of less than 72 ppb for all 21 compounds. And that, and in addition, which they had applied after we had submitted our application, is that the leachate, the SPLP analysis on the soils post-treatment, we could not have a PFOA or PFOS concentration greater than 10 ppt. That 10 ppt number comes from the drinking water MCL for those compounds here within the state of New York. So in December of 2018, we took a run at it. We ended up running the soil through the process system. Tables here basically demonstrate what we ended up with results. Since the point in time which this test was run, as in 2018, October of 2020, New York State put out some guidance in relation to PFOA and PFOS concentrations within soil and the concentrations which are allowed under various reuses under their 375 regulations, which is the remediation regs for the state. And hence why some of these have little carrots next to them, or the up arrows, simply because it went back through the data and looked at it. And accordingly, under our first test run, the soils themselves would have met the residential reuse criteria for the state of New York as of October 2020. At the point in time, they would have met the reuse, except for the fact, as you'll see under the SPLP, PFOS, we did not get down to the 10 part per trillion value that the state was looking for. Obviously, we did multiple tests, and you'll see here I've got a note that these starred items were the highest values that were generated during those particular testing events. So post our first treatment and receiving the analytical, so to continue on. So as we talked about running at 900 degrees Fahrenheit, our average temperature during the test ended up actually being 912. And we had a large reduction in soil organic matter, basically is 9. And we did end up removing the BTU content associated with the soils, which again makes sense because of the fact that that organic matter within our system can become light, can become caught in the airflow generated by our fan, and can end up within the oxidation system as fuel. So the reductions there were expected and anticipated. So post all that analysis and trying to go back and determine whether or not, we should run the material a second time, we basically had a question that we wanted to answer. And that was, could those compounds that were remaining within the soil be desorbed, or was it either so tightly bound to the clay fractions within the soil, or that soil organic matter that they would not be removed or reduced? And second question we had was whether or not we should actually modify anything within the process operation, to which we decided not to. Thought being is that if the process stays consistent, we once again can at least point to whatever occurs from results and have that really truly being related just to the soil matrix itself and not necessarily the process and the management within the equipment. So in February of 2019, we decided to run the material a second time. And as you can see by the results, we were able to get the analysis down to non-detects on both our totals and SPLP analysis. Question may come up in relation to what ND actually stands for. Non-detects on the totals was less than 1 ppb. Non-detects on the SPLP was less than 1 ppt. So very low numbers. The analytical at the time was done by Test America. So most people who have maybe had experience with them and use them know that they're actually seeing at very low levels in relation to both of those topics. The other interesting thing that we really found was that, from the soil organic matter standpoint, we had some reduction, but obviously not complete reduction. So it really didn't much answer the question whether or not that those materials were bound within the soil organic matter, although 0.3%, as we all know, can represent a relatively large concentration when you're talking about parts per billions or trillions, but perhaps not necessarily as intuitive as we hoped it might be if such concentrations ended up being non-detectable. So what did we learn from the whole process? We learned that the technology, as presently deployed, does have the ability for the targeted PFAS compounds, or those that were identified in the analytical, to desorb them from the soil matrix. And as noted there in the 2, adequate to meet the New York State DEC residential reuse criteria that was developed in 2020, and then was also able to meet an SPLP requirement for drinking water standards for the state of New York. We were hoping to have a little more correlation that we could identify between soil organic matter concentrations and the PFAS, either retained or released from the soils. And quite honestly, we don't really have enough data in order to determine whether or not there was truly a correlation there. From our standpoint, the way that it'll be determined is doing or performing additional analysis full scale on various soil matrices so we can determine if such a correlation does actually exist. And the last, obvious little point here is that we still have plenty to learn. Scientifically, based on other work that has been done, soil temperatures or soil treatment temperatures should be able to be less than 900 degrees Fahrenheit, or 912 as we average during our testing. Some of these compounds have boiling points much lower than that, and that process, again, will not be able to be completed unless we have more material or granted additional testing opportunities. And the same thing rolls into our thermal oxidation as far as temperatures are concerned. And the reason I mention that is the facility installed a new thermal oxidation system in 2015. And we modified the airflow within the system and increased the retention time within the oxidative process. And we're able to demonstrate during testing on PCBs at that 1512 degrees Fahrenheit of 5.5 nines removal efficiency, which from our previous system was a much lower temperature than what we had presently employed. And during the same test, we tested at temperatures up over 1700 degrees and ended up having lower removal efficiencies. And a lot of that has to do with airflow in the system and straight lining flow instead of having turbulent flow within there. But so we believe on our side that, the thermal oxidative temperatures, which may ultimately be deployed within a technology, may not be as high as generally predicted. So what's next for Clean Earth? We have fixed facilities in 5 states. In total, we have 8 thermal desorption units, 6 which are fixed, and then 2 which are actually portable that we have moved from one coast to the other, performing operations for for Superfund locations. So we're hoping to end up having more opportunities for us to actually test the technology in proof, what we've been able to demonstrate during our initial testing. What we're finding our largest constraints to be, really the first and foremost is emissions. Being the fact that there is not necessarily an emissions guidance out there for allowable emissions, and that the OTM 45 method for actually performing emissions testing has really recently been put out and not necessarily promulgated, that we find in discussion with states that there's a lot of holdback in relation to moving forward based on those two basic items. And we have had one state that we've worked with where we were apparently, everyone seemed to be able to get on board with emissions, but then we couldn't come to an agreement on how the soil may be able to be reused post-treatment. One of the things that Clean Earth likes to employ and demonstrate with our thermal technologies is that we can actually reutilize the soils post-treatment, and that we don't have to go to another disposal facilities post. So part of that whole discussion was the fact that, we wanted to make sure that we could reuse the soils, and just haven't been able to figure out what that particular location may have interest in those soils meeting for us to be able to perform additional testing. I just throw in here, is there hope for the future? Some, and I'm sure maybe all, realize the fact that there is a thermal desorption facility permitted in Alaska, which we're obviously we follow closely and try to keep tabs on to see what's occurring there. From a thermal oxidative standpoint, Comoros had what I would state is a successful test in the Carolinas. St. Cobain in New Hampshire does have a permit to construct a thermal oxidative system on their systems up there, which again supports the technology that thermal desorption or oxidation does have the ability to control emissions. And a couple of CERTA products that have been done. The CERTA product there noted for 18 was a bench scale on thermal desorption with emissions testing, and demonstrated the fact that they could control PFAS concentrations in the effluent stack at a temperature less than 1800 degrees actually, and have non-detects on their analysis. And the last sort of noted there is actually into the investigation into OTM 45 and its application for the emissions testing for PFAS compounds. So if anyone has any thoughts or comments or items that they think that they would like to know, or have additional input into what we may be trying to do in the future, or has sources of soil that may be of interest, or you have a client who may be interested in testing, this is our shameless plug. Please feel free to reach out to me, and at this point in time, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Robert. Great presentation. I guess now we'll open up the floor for questions.
Yes, my question is for Rob. You present that case study that the first round versus the second round. And my question is, the first round, you have 900 degree F, right? And then the second, you listed there two. One is 900 degree F. The other one is 1800 degree F. So my question is, you said the first round, second round, is that your first round only runs the 900 degrees F, or your first round is you pass 900 degree and then you run the 1800 degree? So I just want to figure out, is that the temperature was higher, then it worked the second round that you meet the SPLP target level, or you meet the cleanup the SPLP target level because you increase the retention time the second round. Just trying to figure out what worked in your case.
Sure, no, it's a very good question. The 900 degree temperature referred to the temperature within the rotary kiln, or our primary treatment unit where the soil treatment was occurring. That temperature was the same on both the first and secondary run. And that was the average temperature of 912 degrees. The 1800 degree temperature is the reference temperature for our thermal oxidative system. So those contaminants that were desorbed from the soil were then run through that thermal oxidation system that averaged 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's two separate processing streams within the process unit itself, but the soils only saw the 900 degree temperature. Does that answer the question?
Yes, she said yes. Thank you.
All right, we do have a question from the audience from Chris Cooley from Port Tampa Bay. Question for the insurance reimbursement. Does brownfield program VCTCs from FDEP reduce reimbursement amount? And do I need to repeat that one?
Question for me, please.
Does brownfield program VCTCs from FDEP reduce reimbursement amount?
If I understand the question correctly, I know that in some states go after recovery. So some reimbursement programs go after recovery. I know Minnesota does, for example. Certainly the federal government does. Somebody said this morning, I think, that CERCLA doesn't have any money. And we've collected over $200 million from old insurance policies from derelict PRPs. But to tell you the truth about FDEP, I have no clue. I just don't know. And I would guess that they do not go after the old insurance in the brownfield program. Now, I wouldn't only guess, I'd bet on it.
I actually had a question for Barry. The folks that lived in Colorado where it was AFFF, right? That was poured.
Yeah.
What made the homeowner want to test her water?
The fire department actually reading about it,
After they did
tested,
it. Okay,
and then they wound up getting,
just curious.
they had a lower fire department, a higher fire department, a lower fire department. And both of them wound up having contamination, as well as like 7 other homeowners. One of them just called me up recently. We put a GAC system in and we're getting 65 ppg. And I just sent him
All right.
the system because it's a mess and the homeowners had to pay for it. So, because it's a voluntary fire department. So
Right.
there's no money there.
Hopefully they remain healthy. I'd like to thank the panelists for their time and input today, and for all of you guys for being our long haulers, hanging around, and everyone on virtually.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, panel. And thank all of our attendants, our in-person and our virtual. For those virtual attendees that are listening, I know we're going to have to reshoot some of those earlier presentations, and I'll make sure that we do that and get that out to everybody. In terms of what you can expect from me, I'll have all the proceedings as well as most of the recordings done this coming week. Just depends on what I have to do in terms of retaping some of the presentations that we lost due to the virtual connections and mishaps that we had. Let's see here, what else? Oh, question I think that I'm going to need from everybody, and we'll do this in a survey that I'll send out, is do I have enough excitement from the group to do this again next year? I guess from my initial reaction with some of the folks that I've talked to, the answer is probably yes. So we'll probably try to do this, whether it's here or whether it's somewhere else. We'll make that decision at some point. But thank you very, very much. I know this has been extremely informative to me, and I hope it was for everybody that's in the room and listening virtually. So thank you, and we'll see you next time. The what? Oh, in terms of if you need certificates of attendance, I did send an email out to everybody. We can do a certificate of attendance. Their self-certification. What kind of spearheaded this is I contacted the state I know we got a bunch of PEs in the room, And so I wanted to find out what that process was. There is a self-certification that we have to issue an affidavit of attendance. And you will get 1 credit hour for every hour of instruction. So on the form that I sent out, that I emailed to everybody, you just need to check the box, and then there's an affidavit attestation to that that says, yes, you attended that session. And we'll maintain that and then issue certificates of attendance based upon how many credit hours you've got. Okay. All righty. Thank you, everybody.